She stood in a courtroom full of white men.
A woman they once called property. And then she did the unthinkable. She accused her master and demanded her freedom. But what shocked them most wasn't her courage. It was that she won. Stay with me, because what this woman said in that courtroom didn't just free her. It helped destroy slavery itself. In the winter of 1781, in the small town of Sheffield, Massachusetts, an event occurred that would reverberate through American legal history. An enslaved black woman named Elizabeth Freeman, known to some as Mum Bett, did something that defied every social convention, legal precedent, and cultural expectation of her time. She walked into a colonial courtroom, stood before white judges and jurors, pointed to a wealthy white man, and declared that he had no right to own her. She accused Colonel John Ashley, one of the most powerful men in Berkshire County, of illegally holding her in bondage. And she lived to tell about it. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell to hear more about enslaved women who fought for their rights. This was not a quiet escape under cover of darkness. This was not a desperate act of violence or rebellion. This was something far more radical. A legal challenge mounted by an enslaved woman who believed that the words written in the Massachusetts Constitution, words she had heard read aloud in her master's house, applied to her too. All men are born free and equal. Elizabeth Freeman heard those words and understood them in a way that would shame the men who wrote them. She heard them and said simply, "I am not a dumb critter." Her case, Brom and Bett versus Ashley, would help end slavery in Massachusetts and establish a legal precedent that challenged the very foundations of human bondage in America. But beyond the legal victory, Elizabeth Freeman's story reveals something even more profound: the intellectual power, strategic brilliance, and moral courage of enslaved people who fought for freedom not with weapons, but with words. This is her story, the full story, of how one woman's refusal to be silent changed the course of American history. To understand the magnitude of Elizabeth Freeman's courage, we must first understand the world she inhabited. Colonel John Ashley was not merely a slaveholder. He was a pillar of colonial Massachusetts society. Born into wealth and educated in the privileges of the colonial elite, Ashley accumulated land, political influence, and social standing throughout his life. He served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, held military rank during the Revolutionary War, and sat on committees that helped draft the very documents that would later be used against him in court. His home in Sheffield was a center of political discourse. Important men gathered there to discuss liberty, natural rights, and the tyranny of British rule. They debated philosophy, read from Enlightenment texts, and crafted arguments about the inherent dignity and freedom of mankind. And as they spoke, Elizabeth Freeman listened. She had been enslaved in the Ashley household since she was approximately 6 months old, purchased along with her sister from a Dutch family in Claverack, New York. For decades, she worked in the house, cooking, cleaning, caring for children, attending to the endless demands of a household that depended entirely on her unpaid labor. But she was not, as the saying went, a dumb critter. She was intelligent, observant, and keenly aware of the contradictions that surrounded her. How could men speak of liberty while holding human beings in chains? How could they declare all men born free and equal while buying and selling children? Elizabeth Freeman did not yet know how she would challenge this hypocrisy. But she was learning. Every conversation she overheard was an education. Every document read aloud in Ashley's parlor was a lesson in the language of freedom. The exact year is disputed. Some accounts place it in 1780, others in 1781. But the event that catalyzed Elizabeth Freeman's pursuit of freedom is documented in multiple sources. Hannah Ashley, the colonel's wife, was known for her volatile temper. On one particular day, she flew into a rage and attempted to strike another enslaved woman with a heated kitchen shovel, a weapon that could cause devastating burns and permanent injury. Elizabeth Freeman intervened. She stepped between the shovel and the other woman, taking the blow herself. The heated metal struck her arm, leaving a deep, painful wound that would scar permanently. But Elizabeth did not cry out. She did not fight back. Instead, she made a decision that would prove far more powerful than any act of physical resistance. She would never again allow herself to be owned. According to later accounts, Freeman refused to let the wound be bandaged or hidden. She wore the scar openly, a visible testament to the violence of slavery. She would later display that scar in court as evidence of the brutality she had endured. This was not merely a personal injury. It was a symbol, a physical manifestation of the moral wound that slavery inflicted on both the enslaved and the enslaver. And Elizabeth Freeman understood the power of that symbol. After the incident with the heated shovel, Elizabeth Freeman made a decision that would require extraordinary patience, intelligence, and courage. She did not run. She did not lash out. Instead, she began to plan. She had heard the men in Ashley's household reading from the newly drafted Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. Article 1 of the Massachusetts Declaration of Rights stated clearly, "All men are born free and equal, and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property. In fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness." Freeman heard those words and understood their radical implication. If all men were born free and equal, then slavery was illegal. The law itself declared her freedom. But knowing the law and enforcing it were two different matters entirely. Elizabeth Freeman needed help. She needed someone with legal knowledge, someone willing to take on a powerful man like Colonel Ashley, someone who believed that the words in the Constitution should apply to everyone. She needed a lawyer. Theodore Sedgwick was a young lawyer in Berkshire County, Massachusetts, with growing political ambitions and increasingly progressive views on slavery. Born in Connecticut and educated at Yale, Sedgwick had moved to Massachusetts to practice law and quickly became known as an articulate and principled attorney. But taking on a case like Elizabeth Freeman's was not without risk. Colonel Ashley was not just any client. He was a man of considerable power and influence. To accuse him of illegally holding people in bondage was to challenge the entire social order of colonial Massachusetts. And yet, when Elizabeth Freeman approached Sedgwick, likely through intermediaries or possibly directly, as accounts vary, he agreed to take her case. Why did Sedgwick agree? Several factors likely influenced his decision. Sedgwick was genuinely troubled by the contradiction between revolutionary rhetoric about liberty and the continued practice of slavery. He had expressed abolitionist sympathies privately and saw the Massachusetts Constitution as a document that could be interpreted to end slavery. The case presented a fascinating legal question. Could the state constitution's declaration that all men are born free and equal be used to invalidate slavery? This was uncharted legal territory, and Sedgwick was intrigued by the challenge. While risky, taking on such a case could establish Sedgwick as a principled attorney willing to fight for justice, potentially advancing his political career in an increasingly abolitionist-leaning Massachusetts. Some accounts suggest that Sedgwick was moved by Freeman's intelligence, dignity, and determination. She was not asking for charity or sympathy. She was demanding what was rightfully hers under the law. Whatever his motivations, Sedgwick agreed to represent Elizabeth Freeman. But she would not be the only plaintiff in this groundbreaking case. Elizabeth Freeman was joined in her lawsuit by another enslaved man known as Brom, sometimes recorded as Brom Pierce or Brom Pierce. Brom was also held in bondage by Colonel Ashley and saw in Freeman's legal strategy an opportunity for his own freedom. The decision to include multiple plaintiffs was strategically brilliant. It demonstrated that the question at hand was not about one individual's circumstances, but about a fundamental legal principle that affected all enslaved people in Massachusetts. It showed that multiple people held in bondage by the same master were willing to challenge their enslavement publicly, suggesting widespread dissatisfaction with the institution of slavery, even among those most powerless to resist it. The case would be filed as Brom and Bett versus Ashley, with Bett being the shortened version of Elizabeth that she was commonly known by. The legal strategy crafted by Sedgwick was both simple and radical. It rested on a straightforward reading of the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, specifically the first article of the Declaration of Rights. The argument was this: the Massachusetts Constitution declared that all men are born free and equal. This was not merely aspirational language or political rhetoric. It was the fundamental law of the state. If all men are born free and equal, then slavery is inconsistent with the Constitution and therefore illegal. Brom and Elizabeth Freeman, as human beings born in a state governed by this Constitution, were therefore free by law, and Colonel Ashley's claim to own them was legally invalid. This argument was revolutionary for several reasons. It treated constitutional language as enforceable law. At the time, many viewed constitutional declarations as statements of principle rather than binding legal rules. Sedgwick's argument insisted that the words in the Constitution meant what they said and could be enforced in court. It extended all men to include black people. This was far from obvious in 1781. The phrase, all men are born free and equal, could easily have been interpreted to apply only to white men or only to citizens. Sedgwick's argument insisted that the language was universal and included enslaved black people. It challenged property rights with human rights. Slavery was fundamentally a property regime. Enslaved people were legally considered property, and property rights were among the most sacred in colonial law. This case argued that constitutional rights to liberty superseded property claims, a radical inversion of legal priorities. It used the master's own words against him. Colonel Ashley had been part of the political establishment that drafted documents proclaiming liberty and equality. Now those very words were being used to challenge his right to hold people in bondage. The hypocrisy of revolutionary rhetoric was being exposed in the most direct way possible. Elizabeth Freeman's case was not occurring in isolation. Massachusetts in the early 1780s was experiencing a broader legal and social reckoning with slavery. The most famous parallel case was that of Quock Walker, another enslaved man in Massachusetts who sued for his freedom around the same time. Walker's case went through multiple trials and appeals, eventually reaching the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court in 1783, where Chief Justice William Cushing would declare that slavery was incompatible with the state constitution. But Brom and Bett versus Ashley came first, and it was tried at the county level before a jury, making it, in some ways, an even more direct test of public sentiment. Would ordinary citizens, sitting on a jury, be willing to declare that a powerful white man had no right to own black people? Elizabeth Freeman was about to find out. The Berkshire County Court of Common Pleas, meeting in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, in August 1781. The room is filled with white men, judges, lawyers, jurors, spectators. The air is thick with the weight of precedent and tradition. And into this space walks Elizabeth Freeman. She is approximately 40 years old. She has spent nearly her entire life enslaved. She has been beaten, scarred, and treated as property. And now she stands before these men and demands to be recognized as a human being with legal rights. The courage this required cannot be overstated. This was not a friendly audience. Many of the men in that courtroom likely owned enslaved people themselves or had family members who did. The economic and social systems of colonial Massachusetts, while less dependent on slavery than southern colonies, still involved slaveholding among the elite. To rule in favor of Freeman and Brom would be to potentially threaten their own property interests. Moreover, the idea of a black woman speaking publicly, contradicting a white man, and demanding legal remedy was almost unthinkable in this context. Enslaved people were supposed to be silent, obedient, and grateful. They were not supposed to be legal strategists who understood constitutional law. But Elizabeth Freeman understood that law better than most of the men in that courtroom, and she was prepared to make her case. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence presented in the trial was physical. The scar on Elizabeth Freeman's arm. Accounts from the period describe how Freeman displayed the scar left by Hannah Ashley's hot shovel. This was not merely evidence of one instance of cruelty. It was a symbol of the violence inherent in the institution of slavery itself. The scar was visible, undeniable, and deeply disturbing to anyone with a conscience. But the scar also served another purpose. It established that Freeman had suffered harm under Ashley's ownership, giving her standing to bring the lawsuit in the first place. It demonstrated that she had legitimate grievances, that she was not simply an ungrateful servant, but a person who had been brutalized and was seeking legal remedy. The visual impact of that scar, a permanent mark of violence on a woman's body, must have been profound in the courtroom. It made abstract arguments about liberty and equality suddenly concrete and personal. The details of the testimony given during the trial are not fully preserved in historical records, but we know from various accounts that Elizabeth Freeman testified on her own behalf. This fact alone is extraordinary. In many legal systems at the time, enslaved people could not testify in court, particularly not against white people. Their words were not considered credible or legally valid. But in this case, Freeman was allowed to speak, and her testimony was entered into the record. What did she say? Based on later accounts and the logical structure of the case, we can infer some of the key points. She testified about the conditions of her enslavement. Freeman likely described the work she was forced to do, the lack of compensation, and the fact that she was treated as property rather than as a person. She described the violence she experienced. The incident with the hot shovel would have been central to her testimony, establishing both the cruelty of her treatment and her determination to end her enslavement. She invoked the Massachusetts Constitution. Freeman testified that she had heard the Constitution read aloud in Ashley's home and understood it to mean that she should be free. Her famous quote, "I heard that paper read yesterday, and I am not a dumb critter," captures her understanding that the law applied to her as much as to anyone else. She challenged Ashley's authority directly. By bringing the lawsuit, Freeman was effectively saying to one of the most powerful men in the county, "You have no right to own me." This was an extraordinary act of defiance and courage. Throughout her testimony, Freeman likely maintained the dignity and intelligence that all accounts of her life emphasize. She was not begging for mercy or appealing to sympathy. She was demanding what the law guaranteed her, freedom. Colonel Ashley's defense, presented by his attorneys, would have rested on several arguments. Property rights. Ashley had purchased Freeman legally under the laws as they existed at the time. She was his property, and the law protected property rights. To declare her free would be to deprive him of his property without compensation. Legal precedent. Slavery had existed in Massachusetts for decades. There was no explicit law abolishing it. The Constitution's language about all men being born free and equal could be interpreted as aspirational rather than immediately enforceable. Social order. Freeing enslaved people through court decisions would destabilize the social and economic order. It would set a precedent that could lead to widespread challenges to slavery. Racial hierarchy. Though likely not stated explicitly in court, the defense probably relied on deeply held assumptions about racial inferiority and the unsuitability of black people for full citizenship and legal rights. These arguments represented the conventional wisdom of the time. They reflected how most people thought about slavery, property, and racial hierarchy. They were the arguments that, in most times and places, would have won. But not this time. After hearing testimony and arguments from both sides, the case went to the jury. These were ordinary citizens of Berkshire County, farmers, merchants, craftsmen. They were white men with varying levels of education and widely different views on slavery. What went through their minds as they deliberated? Some may have been moved by Freeman's testimony and the visible evidence of her scar. Some may have been persuaded by Sedgwick's constitutional arguments. Some may have been uncomfortable with the idea of a powerful man like Ashley owning human beings while simultaneously proclaiming revolutionary ideals of liberty. Others may have been troubled by the implications of the case. If they ruled for Freeman and Brom, what would happen to slavery in Massachusetts? What would happen to property rights? Would this open the floodgates to similar lawsuits? The deliberations likely involved heated debate, conflicting sympathies, and difficult moral and legal questions. But eventually, the jury reached a verdict. The jury ruled in favor of Elizabeth Freeman and Brom. They declared that both plaintiffs were free people, no longer enslaved, and that Colonel Ashley had no legal right to hold them in bondage. Moreover, the jury awarded damages. Ashley was ordered to pay 30 shillings to Brom and Freeman for illegally detaining them. This may seem like a small amount, but the symbolic significance was enormous. It meant that Ashley had committed a legal wrong by holding them as slaves, and he owed them compensation for that wrong. The verdict sent shockwaves through Massachusetts. For the first time, a court had ruled that the Massachusetts Constitution's declaration that all men are born free and equal applied to enslaved black people, and that slavery was therefore illegal under state law. This was not a legislative act. It was not a decree from a governor or a ruling from the highest court in the state. It was a jury of ordinary citizens looking at the evidence and the law and deciding that slavery could not stand. Colonel Ashley could have appealed the verdict. He had the resources and the legal standing to take the case to a higher court. Such an appeal might have resulted in a different outcome, or it might have generated even more publicity for the anti-slavery cause. But Ashley chose not to appeal. Why? Several factors likely influenced this decision. Public embarrassment. The case had already humiliated him publicly. He had been found guilty of illegally holding people in bondage by a jury of his peers. Further appeals would only extend that embarrassment. Changing social climate. Massachusetts was moving toward abolition, and Ashley may have sensed that the tide was turning against slavery. Fighting a losing battle would only damage his reputation further. Economic calculation. The two individuals in question were only a small part of his household. It may have seemed easier to accept the loss than to wage a protracted legal battle. Personal relationship. Some accounts suggest that despite the legal battle, there was a certain respect between Ashley and Freeman. After gaining her freedom, Freeman would eventually return to work for the Sedgwick family as a paid employee, and there are suggestions that Ashley may have harbored some level of admiration for her courage and intelligence. Whatever his reasons, Ashley's decision not to appeal meant that the verdict stood. Elizabeth Freeman and Brom were legally free. After winning her freedom, Elizabeth Freeman faced a question that many newly freed people confronted. How would she support herself? She chose to work for Theodore Sedgwick's family as a paid domestic worker. This decision might seem surprising at first. After fighting so hard for freedom from domestic servitude, why return to similar work? But the distinction was crucial. Freeman was now working for wages, on her own terms, and could leave if she chose to. The Sedgwick family held Freeman in high regard. She became an essential member of the household, not as property, but as a valued employee and trusted friend. She helped raise the Sedgwick children, managed household affairs, and became known throughout the community for her wisdom, competence, and dignity. Catherine Maria Sedgwick, Theodore's daughter, would later write about Freeman with deep affection and respect, describing her as a woman of remarkable intelligence and unwavering moral courage. These reminiscences, while filtered through the perspective of a white employer, nonetheless indicate that Freeman was recognized as an exceptional person even by those who knew her well. Freedom allowed Elizabeth Freeman to live with a dignity that had been denied to her for most of her life. She was able to earn and control her own wages. For the first time, Freeman's labor benefited her directly. She could save money, make purchases, and have economic agency. Maintain family connections. Freeman had a daughter, Elizabeth Betsy, who had also been enslaved. After gaining freedom, Freeman was able to live with and support her daughter without fear of separation through sale or arbitrary decision by a master. Build a reputation. Freeman became known in the community as a skilled nurse and midwife. She attended to sick and dying community members, both black and white, and developed a reputation for competence and compassion in medical care. Command respect. People in Sheffield and the surrounding area knew Freeman's story. She was Mum Bett, the woman who had stood up to Colonel Ashley and won. This gave her a social standing that was rare for black women in that era. Live without fear. Perhaps most importantly, Freeman lived without the constant terror that defined enslaved life, the fear of violence, separation from loved ones, arbitrary punishment, or being sold away. She was legally protected as a free person. One of the remarkable aspects of Elizabeth Freeman's post-freedom life was her ability to achieve a level of economic security. Through her wages from the Sedgwick family and her work as a nurse and midwife, Freeman was able to save money. By the standards of her time, She achieved a comfortable level of financial independence. She was not wealthy, but she was secure. She could support herself and her family without dependence on charity or without the precarity that many free black people faced in the early republic. This economic independence was itself a form of freedom. The freedom to make choices, to live with dignity, and to not be beholden to others for basic survival. As news of Brom and Bett versus Ashley spread throughout Massachusetts and beyond, Elizabeth Freeman became a symbol of the possibility of legal challenges to slavery. Her case demonstrated that the law could be used as a weapon against injustice. Freeman showed that even the most powerless could use legal systems to challenge oppression, if they had the courage and the knowledge to do so. Enslaved people were intelligent legal actors. The case demolished any notion that enslaved people were passive victims or intellectually inferior. Freeman's understanding of constitutional law and her strategic use of the legal system proved otherwise. Constitutional principles could be enforced. The abstract language of all men are born free and equal was shown to have real legal teeth. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was enforceable law. Social change could happen through courts, while legislative action would eventually be necessary to fully abolish slavery nationwide. Freeman's case showed that courts could be venues for social transformation. Elizabeth Freeman's relationship with the Sedgwick family was complex and not without its tensions. She was an employee, but also something more, a person who had fought alongside Theodore Sedgwick in a historic legal battle, and who was clearly respected by the family. Catherine Sedgwick's later writings about Freeman are revealing. She describes Freeman as someone who had nothing of the submissive or subservient character, and who maintained her dignity and independence even while working in the household. Freeman was known to offer her opinions freely, to correct the Sedgwick children when she disagreed with their behavior, and to maintain her own moral compass. There was a genuine, if complicated, affection between Freeman and the Sedgwicks. When Freeman died in 1829, she was buried in the Sedgwick family plot in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, an extraordinary honor that reflected the family's respect for her. The gravestone, erected by the Sedgwicks, reads, Elizabeth Freeman, known by the name of Mum Bett, died December 28, 1829. Her supposed age was 85 years. She was born a slave and remained a slave for nearly 30 years. She could neither read nor write, yet in her own sphere she had no superior or equal. She neither wasted time nor property. She never violated a trust, nor failed to perform a duty. In every situation of domestic trial, she was the most efficient helper and the tenderest friend. Good mother, farewell. This epitaph, while written from the perspective of white employers, nonetheless captures something important. Freeman was recognized as an exceptional person, someone whose character and capabilities were undeniable even to those with privilege and power. The Brom and Bett versus Ashley case, combined with other similar cases like the Quackwalker trials, created a legal environment in which slavery became increasingly untenable in Massachusetts. In 1783, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court heard the Quackwalker case, and Chief Justice William Cushing issued a charge to the jury that effectively declared slavery inconsistent with the state constitution. This ruling, building on the precedent set by cases like Freeman's, marked the effective legal end of slavery in Massachusetts. Massachusetts thus became the first state to abolish slavery through judicial interpretation of its constitution, a remarkable achievement and one that demonstrated the power of legal activism. But it's important to note that this abolition was gradual and complex. It wasn't a single moment of emancipation, but rather a process in which individual cases, court rulings, and changing social attitudes combined to make slavery legally and socially impossible. Elizabeth Freeman's case established several important legal precedents. Constitutional rights apply to everyone. The case established that constitutional language about freedom and equality was not merely aspirational, but could be enforced in court, and that it applied to all people regardless of race. Property rights are not absolute. The case challenged the idea that property rights, including the claimed right to own human beings, were sacrosanct and immune from constitutional challenge. Juries can drive social change, By placing the decision in the hands of ordinary citizens serving on a jury, the case demonstrated that social transformation didn't always require elite decision-making from high courts or legislatures. Sometimes it required ordinary people willing to make the right choice. Standing to sue. The case established that enslaved people had standing to bring lawsuits challenging their enslavement, a significant legal recognition of personhood. These precedents would influence legal thinking about slavery, not just in Massachusetts, but throughout the North, as other states grappled with the contradiction between revolutionary ideals and the continued practice of slavery. While Freeman's case and the subsequent abolition of slavery in Massachusetts was a significant victory, it's important to recognize its limitations. Freedom did not mean equality. Free black people in Massachusetts still faced significant discrimination, limited economic opportunities, and social marginalization. Legal freedom was a necessary but not sufficient condition for true equality. Slavery continued elsewhere. Massachusetts' abolition had no direct effect on slavery in other states. The institution would continue for another 80 years in the South, eventually requiring a civil war to end. Gradual process. Even in Massachusetts, the transition from slavery to freedom was gradual and uneven. Some enslaved people remained in bondage for years after the legal rulings, and enforcement was inconsistent. Economic precarity. Many freed people faced economic hardship. Without resources, education, or capital, freedom could still mean poverty and insecurity. Nonetheless, the case represented a crucial step forward and a powerful demonstration of what was possible when people had the courage to challenge injustice through the law. News of Elizabeth Freeman's case and the Massachusetts court rulings spread throughout the new United States. Abolitionists in other states took note and began crafting similar legal strategies. In states like Vermont, Pennsylvania, and New York, gradual abolition laws were passed, often influenced by the constitutional arguments that had succeeded in Massachusetts. While these processes were different, legislative rather than judicial, they reflected a growing sense that slavery was incompatible with Republican government and revolutionary ideals. The case also inspired enslaved people in other states to seek their own freedom through legal channels. Court records from the late 18th and early 19th centuries show numerous freedom suits filed by enslaved people, many using constitutional language similar to that in Freeman's case. The abolitionist movement, which would grow throughout the 19th century, could point to Elizabeth Freeman as proof that legal challenges to slavery could succeed. Her case became part of the arsenal of arguments and examples that abolitionists used to demonstrate that slavery could be ended peacefully and legally. Elizabeth Freeman probably did not set out to become a political figure or an abolitionist icon. She wanted her own freedom and was willing to fight for it. But in doing so, she became both. Her life after the trial, living with dignity, working for wages, raising her family, and earning respect in her community, was itself a form of activism. Every day that she lived as a free woman was a repudiation of slavery and a demonstration that black people could thrive when given freedom and opportunity. Freeman's story was told and retold throughout her lifetime and after her death. It became part of the narrative arsenal of the abolitionist movement. When people argued that enslaved people lacked the intelligence or capability for freedom, abolitionists could point to Elizabeth Freeman. When people claimed that slavery was legally unassailable, abolitionists could point to her victory in court. In this way, Freeman's personal struggle for freedom became a political act with reverberations far beyond her own life. One of the most striking aspects of Elizabeth Freeman's story is that she survived. This might seem like an odd thing to emphasize. After all, many people involved in legal proceedings survived them. But for an enslaved black woman in the 18th century to publicly challenge a powerful white man and live to tell about it was genuinely exceptional. Consider what could have happened. She could have been killed. Masters had enormous power over enslaved people, and violence, including lethal violence, was always a possibility. An enslaved person who challenged their master's authority risked severe punishment or death. She could have been sold away. Even if not killed, Freeman could have been sold to someone in another state, effectively ending her legal challenge and separating her from any support network. She could have been socially destroyed. Even if legally free, Freeman could have been ostracized, unable to find work or housing, and forced into poverty and marginalization. She could have faced legal retaliation. Ashley could have brought countersuits, claimed damages, or used the legal system to punish Freeman for her audacity. None of these things happened. Freeman not only survived, but thrived. Understanding why requires examining the specific historical context that made her survival possible. Elizabeth Freeman lived in Massachusetts during a unique historical moment. The Revolutionary War had just concluded, and revolutionary rhetoric about liberty, equality, and natural rights was fresh in everyone's minds. The contradiction between this rhetoric and the practice of slavery was impossible to ignore. Massachusetts had several factors that made it more conducive to anti-slavery action than other regions. Smaller enslaved population, unlike southern states where the economy depended heavily on slave labor. Massachusetts had a relatively small enslaved population. Ending slavery would not cause the same economic disruption. Active abolitionist sentiment. Massachusetts had a growing abolitionist movement, with ministers, lawyers, and ordinary citizens expressing moral opposition to slavery. New constitutional framework. The Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 provided new legal language that could be used to challenge slavery. This was uncharted territory, and Freeman's case helped define how that language would be interpreted. Northern location. As a northern state, Massachusetts was geographically distant from the plantation economies of the South, where slavery was more entrenched and resistance more harshly punished. If Freeman had been enslaved in South Carolina or Virginia, her challenge would likely have been impossible. But in Massachusetts in 1781, there was just enough space, legal, social, and moral, for her case to succeed. Elizabeth Freeman's choice to pursue freedom through legal channels rather than through escape or rebellion was strategically brilliant and likely crucial to her survival. By framing her challenge as a legal dispute rather than a rebellion, Freeman forced her opponents to engage on legal terms. Once the case was in court, Ashley had to respond to legal arguments rather than simply exercising raw power. Appealed to principles her opponents claimed to believe. The argument that all men are born free and equal came from the Massachusetts Constitution itself. Freeman was asking the legal system to live up to its own stated principles. Made violence against her more difficult. Once Freeman had legal representation and a court case, harming her would be an obvious attempt to obstruct justice. The legal process itself provided some protection. Created a public record. The trial was public, creating witnesses and documentation that made it harder for Freeman to simply disappear. This strategic use of law demonstrated sophisticated understanding of power dynamics. Freeman understood that direct resistance would be crushed, but that legal challenge, at this particular moment in this particular place, might succeed. Elizabeth Freeman did not act alone. She had crucial allies who made her survival and success possible. Theodore Sedgwick. Without a lawyer willing to take her case, Freeman's legal challenge would have been impossible. Sedgwick's skill, connections, and willingness to challenge Colonel Ashley were essential. The Sedgwick family. After the trial, the Sedgwick family provided Freeman with employment, community standing, and protection. This support network was crucial for her long-term security and flourishing. Community sentiment. The jury that ruled in Freeman's favor represented community sentiment. While not universally abolitionist, enough people in Berkshire County were troubled by slavery to make Freeman's victory possible. Other freedom seekers. Freeman was not the only person challenging slavery in Massachusetts. The presence of other cases, like quackwalkers, created a legal and social context where challenges to slavery were becoming more common and thus less dangerous for any individual challenger. These allies didn't just help Freeman win, they helped keep her safe. A person challenging power in isolation is vulnerable, but a person embedded in a network of support has protection. Elizabeth Freeman herself was a crucial factor in her survival. By all accounts, she possessed exceptional intelligence. Freeman understood constitutional law well enough to recognize its implications for her own situation. She listened carefully to the discussions in Ashley's household and drew correct conclusions about what the Massachusetts Constitution meant for slavery. Freeman knew when to act and how to act. She didn't lash out in anger after being struck with a hot shovel. Instead, she planned a legal challenge that would be far more effective than any act of violence. Dignity and bearing. Accounts of Freeman consistently emphasize her dignified manner and commanding presence. This likely influenced how she was perceived in court and in the community. She commanded respect even from those who might have wanted to dismiss her. Courage without recklessness. Freeman was brave enough to challenge Colonel Ashley, but smart enough to do so through legal channels at a time when such a challenge might succeed. She understood the difference between courage and suicide. Ability to navigate white society. Freeman had spent her life observing and working within white society. She understood how to communicate with white people, how to present herself, and how to be heard, skills that were essential to her courtroom success. These personal qualities didn't make her survival inevitable, but they certainly made it more likely. Freeman was not just lucky. She was brilliant, strategic, and extraordinarily capable. One often overlooked reason for Freeman's survival is that punishing her after her legal victory would have been deeply embarrassing for Colonel Ashley and for the Massachusetts legal system. Ashley had already lost in court. To then retaliate against Freeman through violence, legal harassment, or other means would have exposed the hypocrisy of the legal system. If the court said Freeman was free, but she faced punishment anyway, it would reveal that legal rulings meant nothing. Generated sympathy for Freeman. Public sentiment was already shifting against slavery. Harming a woman who had successfully challenged her enslavement through legal means would only increase sympathy for her and other enslaved people. Damaged Ashley's reputation. Ashley was a prominent man who cared about his standing in the community. Retaliating against Freeman would make him look petty, vindictive, and opposed to the rule of law. Created political problems. Massachusetts was moving toward abolition. Politicians and officials who supported anti-slavery measures would have been outraged by any harm to Freeman. In other words, once Freeman had won her case publicly, she gained a form of protection. To harm her would be to reveal that the entire legal process was a sham, and few people, even those who supported slavery, wanted to admit that openly. The precariousness of safety. While Freeman survived and thrived, it's important not to romanticize her safety. Even as a free woman in Massachusetts, Freeman faced economic vulnerability. Without property or capital, Freeman depended on wages from the Sedgwick family. Loss of that employment could have meant destitution. Racial discrimination. Free black people in Massachusetts faced significant prejudice and had limited opportunities. Freeman's security depended partly on her exceptional abilities and partly on the protection of a wealthy white family. Legal limitations. Free black people did not have full citizenship rights. They could not vote, serve on juries, or hold many positions. Their freedom was real, but constrained. The possibility of re-enslavement. In some states, free black people could be kidnapped and sold into slavery in the South. While less common in Massachusetts, this threat existed. Freeman's survival and flourishing required not just her initial victory, but constant vigilance, hard work, and the maintenance of alliances and reputation. Freedom was not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing project. For many years, Elizabeth Freeman's story was largely forgotten. While locally remembered in Berkshire County and mentioned in some abolitionist literature, she did not occupy a prominent place in American historical consciousness. This erasure is itself revealing. American history has traditionally centered the stories of white men, particularly elite white men. The contributions of black people, women, and working-class people have been systematically minimized or ignored. In recent decades, historians have worked to recover Freeman's story and recognize its significance. She has been the subject of historical studies, children's books, and public commemorations. In 2014, the Massachusetts legislature honored Freeman as one of the state's most important historical figures. This recovery work is essential. It reveals that history is not just about presidents and generals, but about ordinary people who fought for justice in extraordinary ways. It shows that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents in their own liberation. Elizabeth Freeman's story offers several important lessons about law, justice, and social change. Laws can be weapons against injustice. Freeman showed that legal systems, even when designed to uphold oppression, can sometimes be turned against oppressors. The Massachusetts Constitution's language about equality was probably not intended to end slavery, but Freeman used it to do exactly that. Legal interpretation matters. The words in the Constitution didn't change between 1780 and 1781, but their interpretation did. Freeman's case demonstrated that legal language can be interpreted in progressive ways when people have the courage to demand it. The law alone is not enough. While Freeman's legal victory was crucial, it required social conditions, abolitionist sentiment, revolutionary rhetoric, community support to make it possible. Legal change and social change are intertwined. Procedural justice matters. Freeman had access to a lawyer, to a court, and to a jury. These procedural protections made her victory possible. When legal systems deny these protections to marginalized people, justice becomes impossible. Individual cases can have systemic impact. Freeman was seeking her own freedom, but her case helped end slavery throughout Massachusetts. Individual acts of courage can generate broader social transformation. Lessons about power and resistance. Freeman's story also teaches us about power, resistance, and social change. The powerful are not invincible. Colonel Ashley seemed untouchable, wealthy, connected, respected. But Freeman found his vulnerability and exploited it. No form of power is absolute. Strategic thinking multiplies courage. Freeman's courage alone would not have been enough. Her strategic decision to use legal channels, to find allies, and to wait for the right moment turned courage into effectiveness. Marginalized people are not helpless. The narrative of enslaved people as passive victims is false. Freeman and countless others actively resisted, strategized, and fought for their freedom in sophisticated ways. Moral authority matters. Freeman had moral authority. She was right, and everyone knew it. This moral authority created space for her legal challenge to succeed and made retaliation against her more difficult. Change requires risk. Freeman could have accepted her enslavement as unchangeable. Instead, she risked everything, her safety, her relationships, potentially her life, to challenge it. Meaningful change always requires someone to take the first risky step. One of the most important aspects of Freeman's story is what it reveals about intelligence, capability, and the lies used to justify oppression. Oppressed people understand their oppression. Freeman understood slavery, constitutional law, and legal strategy better than most educated white men of her time. Oppression does not diminish intelligence. If anything, survival requires extraordinary intelligence. Education and intelligence are not the same. Freeman could not read or write, yet she understood complex legal concepts and executed a sophisticated legal strategy. Formal education is not the only form of intelligence. Stereotypes are weapons. The stereotype that enslaved people were intellectually inferior was used to justify slavery. Freeman's intelligence and strategic brilliance expose this lie. Recognizing and challenging such stereotypes is essential to justice. Listening and learning happen everywhere. Freeman learned about constitutional law by listening to conversations not meant for her. She turned her master's own words against them. Marginalized people are often observing, learning, and planning even when others assume they're not paying attention. Elizabeth Freeman's story resonates with contemporary struggles for justice in several ways. Legal activism remains crucial. Today's civil rights attorneys, immigration lawyers, criminal justice reformers, and others continue Freeman's legacy of using law as a tool for justice. Constitutional interpretation is always contested. Just as Freeman fought over what all men are born free and equal meant, contemporary activists fight over constitutional meanings. What does equal protection mean? What is cruel and unusual punishment? Constitutional language requires constant interpretation and reinterpretation. Courage and strategy must combine. Social movements today, like Freeman's individual challenge, require both moral courage and strategic sophistication. Righteousness alone doesn't win. Strategy matters. Individual and systemic change are connected. Freeman sought her own freedom, but contributed to systemic change. Today's activists often work on both levels, helping individuals while pushing for broader policy and cultural transformation. Marginalized voices must be centered. Freeman's story reminds us that those most affected by injustice often have the clearest understanding of it and the most creative strategies for challenging it. Justice movements must center marginalized voices, not just ally voices. What would Freeman think of America today? This is, of course, impossible to answer definitively. But it's worth considering what Elizabeth Freeman might think if she could see America in 2026. Progress and disappointment. Freeman would likely see both enormous progress, slavery abolished, civil rights laws enacted, a black president elected, and deep disappointment that racial inequality persists in economic opportunity, criminal justice, education, and other domains. Unfinished work. Freeman fought for freedom, but not for full equality. She would likely recognize that legal freedom was only a first step, and that true equality requires ongoing struggle. The persistence of courage. Freeman might be encouraged by contemporary activists who continue to challenge injustice, use legal strategies, and risk themselves for change. She would recognize kindred spirits in those who refuse to accept oppression as inevitable. The importance of remembering. Freeman might appreciate that her story is being recovered and told. She understood that stories matter, that examples of successful resistance inspire others, and that memory is a form of resistance against erasure. As with many historical figures from marginalized communities, Elizabeth Freeman's story has been subject to both erasure and romanticization. It's important to distinguish between what we know with historical certainty and what is speculation or legend. Historical records for enslaved people are always incomplete because slavery was designed to erase their humanity and deny their personhood. We must work with fragmentary evidence while acknowledging the limits of what we can know with certainty. Much of what we know about Elizabeth Freeman comes from Catherine Maria Sedgwick, Theodore Sedgwick's daughter, who wrote about Freeman years after her death. These accounts are valuable, but must be read critically. Catherine Sedgwick wrote with genuine admiration for Freeman, but she also wrote from the perspective of a privileged white woman reflecting on a black woman who had worked for her family. Her accounts emphasize Freeman's dignity, intelligence, and moral character, all of which were probably accurate. But they also fit into certain narrative patterns common in 19th century writing about exceptional black people. Sedgwick's accounts tell us something true about Freeman, but they also tell us about what white abolitionists wanted to believe about enslaved people and about themselves. We must read these sources carefully, extracting valuable information while remaining aware of their limitations and biases. There is a temptation to romanticize Elizabeth Freeman's story, to make it simpler, more triumphant, and less complicated than it actually was. This romanticization can take several forms. The exceptional individual narrative. Treating Freeman as completely unique can obscure the fact that many enslaved people resisted, strategized, and fought for freedom. Freeman was exceptional, but she was also part of a broader pattern of resistance. The happy ending narrative. While Freeman's life after slavery was relatively secure and dignified, it was not without hardship, limitation, or the ongoing effects of trauma and oppression. Freedom was real, but not perfect. The colorblind triumph narrative. Some retellings of Freeman's story emphasize that she was respected regardless of race, as if racism magically disappeared for this one individual. In reality, Freeman navigated and survived within racist systems, even as a free woman. The law works narrative. Freeman's legal victory was real and important, but it required exceptional circumstances. For every enslaved person who successfully sued for freedom, thousands remained in bondage. Law is a tool that can be used for justice, but it is not automatically or reliably just. We honor Elizabeth Freeman's memory better by acknowledging the complexity and difficulty of her life and accomplishments, rather than by simplifying her story into an easy moral tale. Reclaiming complexity. The most powerful way to engage with Elizabeth Freeman's story is to reclaim its full complexity. She was brilliant, and she lived in a society that denied her education. She was courageous, and she had to calculate her risks carefully because one wrong move could have meant death. She won freedom, and she still had to navigate racist systems for the rest of her life. She was exceptional, and she was one of many enslaved people who resisted in various ways. She achieved legal victory, and that victory depended on circumstances largely beyond her control. She lived with dignity, and she carried the scars, both physical and psychological, of enslavement. This complexity makes her story more powerful, not less. It shows us a real human being navigating impossible circumstances with intelligence, courage, and strategic brilliance. It shows us both the possibility of resistance and the terrible costs of the systems being resisted. Elizabeth Freeman was not the only enslaved person to challenge slavery through legal means. Understanding her story in context reveals both what was unique about her case and how it fit into broader patterns of legal resistance. Quock Walker, Massachusetts, 1781 to 1783. Walker's case went through multiple trials and eventually reached the state Supreme Court, where Chief Justice William Cushing ruled that slavery was incompatible with the Massachusetts Constitution. Walker's case is often cited alongside Freeman's as ending slavery in Massachusetts. Jenny Slew, Massachusetts, 1766. Years before Freeman, Slew successfully sued for her freedom, arguing that she had been illegally enslaved. This earlier case established that enslaved people could bring lawsuits in Massachusetts courts. Elizabeth Key, Virginia, 1656. Over a century before Freeman, Key successfully sued for her freedom in colonial Virginia, arguing that her father had been a free Englishman and that she should therefore inherit his free status. Dred Scott, Missouri/Federal, 1857. Scott's unsuccessful attempt to sue for his freedom resulted in the infamous Supreme Court ruling that black people could not be citizens. This case shows that legal strategies did not always succeed and that higher courts could overturn progressive lower court rulings. These cases reveal that legal challenges to slavery were more common than often recognized, but also that they required specific circumstances to succeed. Freeman's success was not inevitable, but depended on timing, location, legal strategy, and available allies. Legal challenges were only one form of resistance to slavery. Understanding the full range of resistance strategies reveals how Freeman's approach fit into a broader struggle. Escape. Thousands of enslaved people escaped through the Underground Railroad and other means. This was perhaps the most common form of direct resistance. Rebellion. From small acts of sabotage to major uprisings like Nat Turner's Rebellion, armed resistance was always present, though risky and often brutally suppressed. Cultural preservation. Maintaining African cultural practices, creating new forms of music and storytelling, and building community were forms of resistance against cultural erasure. Economic resistance. Slowdowns, tool breaking, and other forms of work resistance undermined the economic efficiency of slavery. Legal maneuvering. Like Freeman, many enslaved people used legal systems to challenge their enslavement, negotiate better conditions, or secure freedom for family members. Political organizing. Free black people and some enslaved people engaged in political organizing, petition drives, and advocacy for abolition. Freeman's legal challenge was one strategic choice among many. It worked for her in her specific context, but it was not the only valid or heroic form of resistance. All these strategies required courage and deserved recognition. Elizabeth Freeman's identity as a woman adds important dimensions to her story. Gendered violence. The violence Freeman experienced from Hannah Ashley was gendered, woman-to-woman violence within a household setting. The hot shovel attack was part of a pattern of violence that enslaved women experienced from slaveholding women as well as men. Reproductive exploitation. While not directly documented in Freeman's case, enslaved women faced sexual violence and reproductive exploitation that added layers of trauma beyond what enslaved men experienced. Freeman's daughter was also enslaved, raising questions about whether Freeman faced threats to separate her from her child. Domestic labor. Freeman's work was domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, childcare, which was gendered and often invisible or undervalued even as it was essential. Different paths to resistance. Some scholars argue that enslaved women were more likely to use legal and negotiation strategies rather than armed resistance, partly because their responsibilities for children made certain forms of resistance more costly. Intersectionality. Freeman faced oppression at the intersection of race, gender, and class. Understanding her story requires attending to how these forms of oppression interacted and compounded. Freeman's story is not just a story about slavery and freedom. It's also a story about gender, power, and the specific forms of violence and resistance that marked enslaved women's experiences. If Elizabeth Freeman could see America in 2026, 245 years after she stood in that courtroom and demanded her freedom, what would she say? This is not an idle question. It forces us to reckon with how far we've come and how far we still need to go. It asks us to measure our society against the standards of justice that Freeman fought for. She might say, "You kept some promises and broke others." Freeman won legal freedom, and slavery was eventually abolished nationwide. But the promise of equality, the promise that all people are born free and equal, remains unfulfilled. Racial disparities in wealth, health, education, and criminal justice reveal that legal freedom alone was not enough. The courage is still needed. Freeman would recognize in contemporary activists the same courage she embodied, the willingness to stand up to power, to demand justice, to risk oneself for change. She might see echoes of her own struggle in Black Lives Matter organizers, immigration rights activists, criminal justice reformers, and others who refuse to accept oppression as inevitable. Don't make me a saint. Make my strategy a blueprint. Freeman would probably resist being elevated to sainthood. She was a human being who made a strategic decision based on careful analysis of her situation. What matters is not treating her as uniquely heroic, but learning from her strategic brilliance and applying similar analysis to contemporary struggles. Remember that law is a tool, not a savior. Freeman used law brilliantly, but she also knew its limitations. Law can be a weapon for justice, but it can also be a weapon of oppression. What matters is who wields it, how it's interpreted, and what social movements back it up. The words you speak about freedom, do you mean them? This might be Freeman's most cutting question. She took the words of the Massachusetts Constitution seriously and demanded that others do the same. Are we willing to take seriously the promises of equality and justice in our founding documents? Or are they just rhetoric? Elizabeth Freeman's story is not just history. It's a challenge. It challenges us to take seriously the gap between our stated values and our lived reality. Freeman saw the hypocrisy of men speaking of liberty while holding people in bondage. What hypocrisies do we tolerate today? Recognize the intelligence and agency of marginalized people. Freeman was not a victim waiting to be saved. She was a strategic actor who saved herself. How do contemporary conversations about injustice center or marginalize the voices of those most affected? Use every tool available for justice. Freeman used legal strategy because it was available and appropriate to her context. What tools are available to us? And are we using them effectively? Be willing to risk for what's right. Freeman risked everything, her safety, possibly her life, to challenge injustice. What are we willing to risk? Remember that individuals can change systems. Freeman was seeking her own freedom, but contributed to ending slavery throughout Massachusetts. Individual acts of courage can have systemic impact. If Elizabeth Freeman could stand in a court that was never built for her and win, what truths are still waiting to be spoken today? This is the question that should haunt us. What injustices do we tolerate that future generations will view with the same horror we now feel toward slavery? What systems of oppression seem inevitable today, but could be challenged by someone with Freeman's courage and strategic brilliance? What constitutional promises remain unfulfilled, waiting for someone to demand that they be honored? What truths need to be spoken in courtrooms, legislative chambers, corporate boardrooms, and public squares? Elizabeth Freeman did not accept that her enslavement was inevitable, natural, or legal. She challenged it, and she won. Her victory did not solve all problems, but it proved that change was possible. The question for us is, what will we refuse to accept? What will we challenge? What truths will we speak? Freeman's scar, the permanent mark left by Hannah Ashley's hot shovel, was both a wound and a weapon. It was evidence of the violence of slavery and a symbol of her determination to end it. She wore that scar openly, refusing to hide it, using it to tell her truth. What scars does our society bear? What wounds do we try to hide? And who will have the courage to expose them, to speak truth about them, to demand that they be healed? Elizabeth Freeman could not read or write, but she understood the law better than the educated men who wrote it. She could not vote or hold office, but she changed Massachusetts more profoundly than most legislators. She had no property and no formal power, but she defeated one of the most powerful men in her county. She did this by believing that the words, "all men are born free and equal," meant what they said. She did this by having the courage to demand that those words apply to her. She did this by finding allies, using strategy, and refusing to be silent. And she lived. Not just survived, but lived. With dignity, with purpose, with respect, with family, with freedom. Her story asks us, what could we accomplish if we had her courage? What could we change if we combined moral clarity with strategic brilliance? What walls could we tear down if we refused to accept that they were permanent? Elizabeth Freeman stood in a courtroom in 1781 and said, in effect, "I am a human being. I have rights, and I will not be owned." The world tried to tell her that this was impossible. The law said she was property. Society said she should be silent. Power said she should be obedient. She said no, and she won. That is her legacy. That is her challenge to us. That is the truth that is still waiting to be spoken.